Okay, so how's it going? I just watched the Odyssey. I watched it last night. Got a few hours sleep. And this is my just brief morning after thoughts. This is not meant in any way to be some sort of exhaustive review or critique of either the adaptation or the filmmaking in general. Just a few things worth sharing. I may come back to do an essay later, I may not. But I thought, whilst I had a few of these ideas, I'd share them with you now. So just a brief background, my relationship with the source material. So obviously I saw the '97 movie. I saw the Refrain movie, The Return. I've read a graphic novel adaptation. I read the like kind of an abridged version, not necessarily for children, but it was just like something that I pulled off of like my mum's library shelf when I was a kid. She has both, the Iliad and the Odyssey. So I'm familiar with and of course I remember the cartoon, Ulysses 31, French Saturday morning cartoon style show. So I'm familiar with the characters. I'm familiar with the story, to some extent. So I mean, first of all, it's a pretty great film. It's pretty great. That's the baseline. Now a couple of things about it. I just jotted some brief notes here. Okay, so to talk about the character Odysseus himself, how he's characterized. Now, typically in the adaptations, or like all previous adaptations, there's a few things about Odysseus specifically that make up his character. He's clearly quite competent. He's a man who inspires loyalty in his men, and treats them fairly. But he's a very, very clever man. He got tricks up his sleeve, and he also has some hubris. So just talking about how they tackled the hubris of Odysseus in the film. Now, in previous adaptations, the real sort of killer moment you see essentially Odysseus like write his own destruction with his own pride is when they escape Polyphemus's cave. Polyphemus, the Cyclops. So the original story, basically, the men find themselves in the cave. The giant, the Cyclops, comes into the cave, locks the door with a boulder, and Odysseus uses, and his men, they've got wine. They use the wine essentially to goad the Cyclops into sleep. And so like Odysseus tells him a story and he sings for him and dances. It's obviously it's a bit different in the literary adaptations, but that's what happens there. And they ply the Cyclops with wine until he falls asleep. They stab him in the eye, and when the Cyclops asks his name, he claims that he is nobody. So later, when Odysseus escapes the cave, the Cyclops is calling out to his friends. He's like, I'm hurt. And then, his giant's friends have called back out to him, so who hurt you? And he's like, nobody hurt me. And, so all the men are running away as Polyphemus is shouting out, I'm going to get you, nobody, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, so Odysseus and his men, they get onto the ship. They start escaping, but this is where his pride takes over. Now, once again, this is the previous adaptations, different from the film. I'll explain how the film tackles this differently. The men are on the ship, and he can't help himself. Odysseus calls back out to Polyphemus and says, it is I, Odysseus, king of Ithaca. I'm the one who got you. And of course, that's the catalyst by which Polyphemus could then, entreat his father, Poseidon, the god of the sea and the wind, and say, like, this is why Poseidon, like, has it in for Odysseus. Now, broadly in the film, the gods are treated they're basically subsumed into human superstition. I'll explain more about that later. So, in the movie, they basically pull the same plot. They don't feed wine to Polyphemus, and they don't sing to him or dance or anything like that. They don't even speak to him. Basically, Giant comes into the cave, munches a couple of heads. The rest of the men hide. And when they finally get their chance, once again, they heat up the stake and they blind Polyphemus and strap straw to their backs so that as the sheep are leaving the cave. I mean, and this part is part of the original story as well, where, Polyphemus, because he's blind now, he's reached his hand out to make sure it's only the sheep leaving and not the men, but because the men have got straw attached to their backs, he thinks the men are sheep. So they're able to kind of get out like this. And, they run down to the ship and they're jumping on the ship, and there is no such proclamation of hubris by Odysseus at this point. So they've essentially glossed over that a little bit here, but I'll explain how they managed to incorporate that part of his character in this adaptation. Later in the film, Odysseus encounters the Sirens. Now, this is from the traditional story as well, and how this is handled is also the same as in the traditional story, but because of how this occurs, this is sort of where they show Odysseus's pride and how that, I won't say brings him undone, but it forces him to sort of confront his own horror. So as his ship is, sailing past the Sirens, like, he knew this was coming, so he's gotten all of the men to put wax in their ears so they won't be lured by the Sirens. And, he gets his men to lash him to the mast because he's proud enough to want to stare into the abyss and be able to look back from it, He wants to hear the Siren song. He knows how dangerous they are, so he's not foolish enough to just, stand there and just listen, which is why, he gets the men to lash him. But this is essentially where we see his own pride. Now, when it comes to the Siren song itself, just a few words about the soundtrack. So this is roughly the halfway point in the movie where the Siren event occurs. And basically everything up until that point, the soundtrack it's heavy in the mix. Not to the point you can't hear the men talking to each other, but there is pretty much the entire time some kind of symphonic score in the background. But it's very, there's no pun intended here at all, but it's very light on leitmotif. Leitmotifs being specific musical themes that point to a character or a concept, basically. In a movie, when you see a certain character, that character has a particular theme, or the story will have a specific theme. Like, for example, I think of Star Wars and the Force theme, where, Luke's looking out at the two suns in Tatooine, and we hear the Force theme. there, and any sort of other circumstance where the Force, because the Force is calling out to Luke to go on this adventure. We're to assume whenever the Force has another strong influence on the story, we hear that Force theme. Da 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 da. This theme. So in the Odyssey, up until this point, there really hasn't been any sort of strong signposting of any particular motifs. You could argue that there has been some motif foreshadowing where they use a few undertones here and there, but overall, the chord sequences used in the symphony up to this point have a very meandering quality, like where the phrasing will sort of end on the fourth chord or the second chord. So you're not getting this sense of resolution, like that strong, like 5 back to 1 type of resolution that is typical, not just in pop music, but of course in movie soundtracks as well. Now, as I say, this is only up until that halfway point. So at that halfway point where the men are putting the wax in their ears, they lashed Odysseus to the mast. So it's like Odysseus is like his second in charge, like his main man, his first mate, essentially, on the ship, Eurylochus. He's like the last of the men to put the wax in his ears, and the moment at which he puts the wax in, the soundtrack has a low pass filter put on it. So it mimics like that sense of, if you were, submerging your head in water, or, if you understand how, frequency application works, they're basically shut down all of the high frequencies, so you're only hearing the very, very low frequencies at this point. Just like you would if you stuck your fingers in your ears, or in fact put wax in there. So this is a very, very effective use of sound and vision together to tell a particular story. Now at this moment, so we get the low pass filter, and then an overall decrease in volume. And for what I believe is the first time we hear a 4-chord refrain that is played on 3 reeds, right? I'm not sure exactly what reeds they are, whether it's... I've got a feeling that some maybe traditional or even medieval instrument is used. It could just be a clarinet, right? But it had the quality of being a very raw, unpolished, harmonically thin kind of sound. But of course, when you've got these 3 reeds together, you can outline a chord. And so we get this 4-chord sound of these reeds. And once again, I only watched it the one time last night, but I'm thinking about this particular chord sequence. And the chord sequence outlines the Dies Irae, which is... most people would have... that loosely translates to Day of Wrath. But the cultural imprint where most people will be familiar with that particular sonic shape is in Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, the very beginning, the dun 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 dun. These are like the 4, like the top line melody that we hear in that is subsumed into this 4-chord shape. So we then get this repeating 4-chord shape, and at this time there's no other music happening, no other sound other than perhaps the most muffled, most low passed sound, just to create some texture. But so the boat is sailing past the rock or the island of the Sirens. The men have wax in their ears. Odysseus is lashed to the mast. And at this time, we as the audience are denied the sound of the sirens. It doesn't show us that sound just yet. What we get instead is just this four chords on these reeds. Now, later on, because the way in which the story is told, it's a non-linear storytelling. If you're familiar with, movies like, Pulp Fiction or something like that, something with non-linear storytelling, we've got sort of like these extended flashback sequences, because essentially where we start, we get sort of little flashbacks here and there, and then we get these whole sections. We kind of start with Odysseus in the company of Calypso, the demigoddess who essentially falls in love with Odysseus and holds him in the original story. She holds him a captive for 7 years. That's handled with a bit more subtlety now. He does in fact stay with Calypso for 7 years, but they've used if you're familiar with the original story, there's a sequence that occurs in the story that doesn't occur in the film with the land of the Lotus Eaters. What they've done instead is they've kind of, once again, they've subsumed that into the Calypso captivity. So our story sort of starts with Odysseus in the company of Calypso, but he is non-compos mentis. He has been eating flower of the lotus every day, and that, it gets him high, and it prevents him from being able to remember anything. So that's kind of how they've introduced that concept there. Charlize Theron plays Calypso. Fantastic job. Anyway, non-linear storytelling. So as I said, we are initially denied, as an audience, we denied the song of the Sirens. But we do get the Siren song a bit later. With the non-linear storytelling, it's only afterward where we get to see essentially the reasoning why that Odysseus has been kept from home for so long. Now, he doesn't blame it on Calypso. He doesn't. This is when he's later talking to his wife Penelope back in Ithaca, but under the guise of the beggar. So she doesn't know. She doesn't know it's Odysseus who's speaking to her. But maybe she knows, but maybe she doesn't. It's shot in a very, very creative and careful way. So Odysseus is recounting his own culpability, basically, and he tells Penelope about the act of the sack of Troy. Overall, he's essentially talking about his great regrets, in that he feels like, he's unleashed a chaos into the world, that by the use of his trick, the Trojan horse, he saw horror. He deeply regrets. He deeply regrets the sack of Troy, and his own horror is rooted in that particular act. Now, during this which is essentially a flashback to the sack of Troy, this is actually where we hear the Siren song. Now, mate, and the way we hear it, we hear three female vocalists. It sounded like perhaps two altos and a soprano, creating this very, very close harmony. And it's during this sequence where we start to get the shape of the actual overall motif, the leitmotif, that is, if we had to ask what it is pointing to, the leitmotif, I suppose, represents Odysseus the character, Odysseus's memory, and Odysseus's Odyssey. The fact that there really is, as far as I can tell, only this single motif in the entire soundtrack that seems completely absent at the beginning, and it's only really right toward the end of the film that the motif starts to take shape and is ultimately solidified with a melodic top line, and they bring in this 4-chord 3-reed pattern. So you've got the dies irae underneath, and then you have, that juxtaposed against the Siren song. And this is, once again, this is during the sack sequences. And then later on, in the final battle in the Great Hall, when Odysseus must face all the suitors, we get the melodic top line on top of this. And this is, the top line is, if you like, the motif itself. And it felt like halfway through I was feeling like, because obviously I'm someone who's super interested in, soundtracks and how music is used in film. And like halfway through the whole movie, I'm thinking, where the hell are the motifs? But the fact that it's just like kind of this slow build all the way until the end before they sort of finally reward us with the actual shape of the motif. It was an act of great restraint on the parts of the composer. And it's Zimmer, I think, maybe, and someone else. It has to be right. It's a Nolan film. And I didn't even check the credits when we were watching it. But I was too busy talking to my brother. That's who I saw the movie with. But yes, this is an incredible act of restraint on the part of the composers to only create one motive and spend the whole movie building up to that one melody line. So I mean, it's an incredible work. Maybe it's even out now. I'll have a look for the soundtrack at some point soon. But yeah, incredible. So for me, like, the music is always the biggest part of a movie. So I've just got some notes here. What else? So Antinous, or Pattinus, as some people are calling him. This is Pattinson's Antinous, or Antinous. I've never known how to pronounce it. It's spelt like Antinous. Antinous. I don't know. Anyway, his character, of course, because it's Robert Pattinson, you can guess. It's portrayed in a fantastic way. He's like one of the greatest character actors of his generation. So yeah, the character is portrayed. There's a couple of things about it which were slightly on the nose, but I didn't bother me because I was in on the joke as such, and I'll explain that to you. So the story of Antinous in this adaptation, Antinous is effectively a draft dodger. Okay, he was selected by random draw to go on the campaign to Troy, and through a bit of subterfuge and through the mercy of Odysseus, Antinous is able to escape that duty. So casting him as a draft dodger, as I said, it's a little on the nose, only in that, like Donald Trump's a draft dodger, etc. But hey, fuck that guy. So it didn't bother me. I just thought it was a bit funny. And it could be entirely coincidental that the story is told in that way, but it might also not be coincidental. And it was kind of funny. Maybe it's like kind of an inside joke, perhaps. But yes, so that's how Antinous was framed in this particular adaptation. And it's not just that he was a draft dodger, but it's also that at no point is he willing to like get his own hands dirty, but he uses charisma to influence other people. And firstly, he uses his charisma to seduce Penelope's handmaiden, played by a Mia Goth. And it's via that seduction Antinous is able to learn Penelope's secret, which is, of course, the fact that this burial shawl that she's been weaving for a very long time, at night she gets there and she kind of undoes the work she did that day. So during the day when the suitors are in the hall, they can see she's working on the shawl, but then at night, she undoes the work. And her handmaiden knew this, and Antinous discovers this because the handmaidens told him, because he seduced her. So that's one sort of example of Antinous' charisma. Then there's the second example where he's close to seducing Penelope herself. And it's only when Antinous is sort of forced to reveal through Penelope's questioning. Antinous is forced to reveal that he kind of intends to like have his own son with Penelope and disinherit Telemachus, Odysseus' son. And it's at this moment when Penelope realizes that Telemachus will be disinherited. This is like the poisoned moment for her, and she kind of recoils from him at this point. And because she understands his true intentions there, his charm is wasted on her at that point. Now, even though he possesses, as I say, this level of charisma, he's also a very poisonous character in general. And this isn't hidden from us at all. So the audience, when we're looking at Antinous, we see a snake, right? We see a snake. And this is not by accident. This is exactly the character they want to show us. So that was Antinous. What else have I got here? Your filtered is Irae, sacking of Troy, mighty resolution. Grounded heroics. So Odysseus is characterized as a man of extreme martial competency. Of course, he was essentially a tribal leader. He was the king of Ithaca. He was a war commander during the Trojan War, and he is a man of particular personal prowess. However, one of the things this adaptation does is that it really tries to ground him in humanity, show that he's not invincible. And during this is like kind of exemplified in the last battle in the Great Hall, when you have, Odysseus essentially, he strings the bow, he shoots the axes, thus revealing himself as the true king, because up until this point, he's disguised as a beggar. So once he's revealed himself as Odysseus, having made sure earlier that there would be no weapons in the hall, and then he goes on a bit of a kill spree, and he's essentially fighting against, I don't know how many men there are in total, maybe 30 men, 50 men. Now, they're not all attacking him at once. You know, they're kind of going down one by one, as he's, you know, very competent archer, and he's sort of like killing them all one hit at a time. And a few of them come in and try to attack him, and he defeats them, blah, blah, blah. But yeah, eventually the men start to swarm him, and he's still sort of managing to take a few out here and there. But now, during this process, as Odysseus is killing the suitors, some of the suitors and their servants are sort of starting to kneel, like one by one, as they're recognizing, well, hang on a second, this, I can see how this is turning out. This is turning out badly for Antinous. It looks like Odysseus is going to win. He's gonna kill us all unless we bow, basically. So one by one, you start to get like these men bowing, and then their servants sort of all kneeling down. So not only obviously is he reducing the force against him by killing men, but they're taking themselves out of the battle as well. And even so, he eventually starts to be overcome by the swarm of men attacking him. And it's only Telemachus's eventual intervention. There's kind of this side plot going on where, like, one of the suitors has gone to try and find the weapon stash, which is upstairs, and he's busting a hole through the floor and like throwing weapons down into the hole, so the other suitors can, grab weapons, etc. And Telemachus is like having his own battle with that guy. But yeah, so eventually Telemachus eventually manages to beat the guy upstairs, grab a sword, throw it down to dear old dad, and there finally Odysseus has a sword, and now they're all afraid. None of them will stand against him now that Odysseus has a sword. And finally, Odysseus confronts Antinous. And without just giving you like a beat for beat everything that happens, like, did I even say there'd be spoilers? Surely you must know there'll be spoilers. I'll make sure there's a note at the start. Yes, there's lots of spoilers. The story's, 2,500 years old. Hard to spoil a story that's been out that long, but I guess, I'm spoiling the adaptation. So I will put a warning in there. But yeah, they show that Odysseus is a human. He can be defeated. He just wasn't. Now, there is a moment. This is kind of an extreme spoiler, I suppose. So turn it off now if you don't want to hear this. Basically, and right at the end, I thought, because of how it's set up, and he's taken a couple of arrows, and he's even taken a knife in the neck. It looks like maybe Odysseus is going to die. And at this moment, I'm looking at it thinking, oh, wow, that's, like quite a huge deviation from the story. But it's also a really ballsy one, too. If the story ended with Odysseus dying, which it doesn't, okay, Odysseus survives. But if the story ended with him dying, I might have even liked it more. Not because I like the idea Odysseus dies, but it was a really powerful moment. A really powerful moment there. That being said, the actual end is fine, which is, he doesn't actually die. he, bequeaths the kingdom to Telemachus, who ascends as king. And he and Penelope literally go sailing off into the sunset. Literally. Now, I mean, that's all fine. But there was like a piece of it that was, and this is another thing that I felt was like kind of on the nose a little bit. Now, there's sort of a three-party here. So, the first of those is, so the movie Troy, right? Which, I enjoy the movie Troy. I think particularly the choreography of the Achilles v Hector fight is fucking amazing. And I think that Brad Pitt plays a really cool Achilles. That was, and Eric Bana plays an amazing Hector. It's a pretty cool movie overall, and a decent adaptation of the Iliad, at least in the certain aspects of the Iliad that it actually adapts. Because the Iliad actually, it's 10 years of warfare, right, in the Iliad. And the movie Troy, it looks like it might have been a 3-week campaign, So there's obviously a lot left out in Troy. Anyway. So this kind of, just briefly to talk about casting. The fact that, so the War of Troy, you've kind of got the Greeks on one side and the Persians on the other side. And they're not like, there's not a big distance between, like in antiquity, there's not a big distance between the ethnic Greeks and the ethnicity of the Persian Empire. And the Persian Empire isn't a single ethnicity in the same way that we think of Persians today. Because, of course, the Persian Empire was vast. But Troy, of course, was a city-state, modern-day Turkey, basically, but a city-state in modern-day Turkey. And yeah, so I'm kind of getting bogged down in the weeds here. But so yeah, in antiquity, you got the Greeks on one side, the Persians on the other, and of course in the movie Troy, they're just all Caucasians, right? So okay, fine. I mean, I don't think it matters that much who is cast, as long as, especially in the case of a myth, right? As long as the characters are done justice. And I think, Brian Cox as Agamemnon, it's a different casting, but, and we had Brendan Gleeson as Menelaus. By the way, John Bernthal played a sick Menelaus. I actually was expecting to not like Bernthal as Menelaus, but I actually liked him. Anyway. So as I said, the thing that was on the nose, the three-parter, the first parter is Troy. Troy gives us this very modern-day Western-centric lens, okay, to characterize the Trojan War. And because the movie Troy is, I'm not going to say it's the definitive adaptation, but I'm going to say, in the eyes of a Western film-going audience, this is the definitive adaptation of the Iliad. They don't know the Iliad, they know the movie Troy, right? Unless they're classic students or study classics at uni or whatever. So this is now it doesn't explicitly try and say, these were all Caucasian people here. I mean, we know they weren't. But it's a like a cinematic sort of cultural touchstone that we have this Troy image like in the back of our minds. So the second part of this three-parter is 300. Now specifically I'm referring, once again, 300, Greeks and Persians, right? Classic battle. we have David Wenham's character, whose name escapes me, but he played, if you're familiar with the movie 300, you know, obviously we had Gerard Butler as Leonidas, the Hero King. David Wenham, he was the guy he sent back to Sparta to sort of tell the story of the last 300 that remained behind when he bid everyone else to leave. The movie 300, of course, takes a lot of liberties with the actual Thermopylae story. In the story, it's actually kind of like 10,000 men, right? You've got, well, I think it's just like, you know, you got thousands of Spartans there. You have thousands of Arcadians there, you know, and other Lacedaemonians in general. Like, there were a lot of, I think there are sort of at least sort of 4 or 5 Greek city-states involved in the men that they provided to fight at Thermopylae. And then it's actually the 300 is the last 300 men that remain behind when everyone else goes home. Okay. So David Wenham's character, he's the one who goes back to Sparta and then comes back with the help of the Athenians. And essentially now there's a lot more sort of Greek city-states that have gotten involved in fighting against the Persians in the 300 movie, sort of like right at the end. And David Wenham's character, he gives this speech about, you know, sort of Greek civility and philosophy, like standing tall as this bastion of Western democracy and civilization, and that, you know, us here in the West, right? It's funny to think of myself in the West as an Australian, because we're our own continent at the foot of Southeast Asia, right? But yeah, Australia is part of, you know, Western society, Western culture, whatever else. Obviously, the continental USA is the main concept, like continental Europe and the continental USA. So once again, two-parter. The thing I'm getting at here, when I'm discussing this in this way, sort of creates this picture that our modern society is the descendant, that we are the cultural inheritors of this Greek legacy, which isn't entirely untrue. It's not entirely untrue, okay? But it's worth saying that it's not elsewhere, as in, like, it's not America where democracy rose after Greece. Like, I mean, there's a lot of steps down the line, okay, before we end up having, you know, some sort of democratic society in America. Anyway, as I said, this is a 3-parter, so that's the first 2 parts. The third part here, the end of Christopher Nolan's Odyssey. Okay. So, once Odysseus and Penelope sort of pack up their bags, get onto the ship, and they're going to go and sail into the sunset, sail out into the west. Okay. Sail out past the Pillars of Hercules and into the unknown lands of the west. Okay, there's kind of only one bit of land once you keep going west from there. You know, you're going to hit Greenland, Canada, continental North America, right? And the story that they're telling each other is basically saying, oh, you know, we unleashed chaos on the world. We had this beautiful civilization, and we've sort of destroyed civilization. The world's kind of in chaos now. But don't worry, like, civilization will rise again. Okay, is the story they're telling as they're sailing effectively to America, right? It's slightly more ambiguous than that, okay? And it doesn't strictly mention the Pillars of Hercules. But Spain, right? Like, I mean, if we're going to go from the Greek peninsula and start going west, like we got like Italy, right? Italy and Sicily, then sort of France, and then Spain. Okay, Spain isn't the unknown lands of the West. Okay, the Mediterranean Sea is known to the Greeks, right? They know the Greek side, they know the Persian side, they know the African side. Okay, the Mediterranean is known to the Greeks. Talking about the lands unknown, they're talking about sailing out past the Pillars of Hercules. Now, the Pillars of Hercules, in case you're not familiar with that particular framing, is the exit of the Mediterranean Sea between North Africa and south of Europe, like Gibraltar. If you go in between, like, Africa and Gibraltar, that's the Pillars of Hercules. Pass through the Pillars of Hercules. That's the lands unknown on the other side of that sea, right? So we are talking about the continental North America. So once taken on its own is fairly ambiguous. But if we take that with the other two parts, if we take this cinematic memory of Troy alongside with ultimately like the bit of propaganda at the end of 300, alongside with this story of, a future bright civilization in the Western lands unknown. Yeah, this is why it's not like I hate it, okay? I don't hate it, but it did kind of feel like an ode to America, if you like, that didn't necessarily belong in an adaptation of the Odyssey. I'm not having a shit about it. It's just something I noticed, something that is unique in this adaptation, something they've put into this story, is this little sort of nod to America. And so there is perhaps one more layer to this. Well, there might be even more layers, but there is one more sort of layer here. So the moral to the story, the idea that this consolidated hegemonic Greek power, okay, this Western power, hegemonic Western power, Agamemnon and Menelaus have rallied all Greece to go and fight the enemy in the east, the Persians at Troy. And by doing so, they've unleashed chaos on the world. Okay, Western hegemonic power unleashing war on the east creates chaos. And, topicality, modern politics, fucking Western hegemonic power creating war, waging war on the East, the Middle East in this particular case. I think you all know which conflict I'm talking about here, but yeah, the unleashing of chaos. So yeah, that's like technically like this extra layer. So it's like a sort of meta commentary on topical politics, but done in an oblique fashion. So yeah, there is, I suppose, potentially that other layer to it as well. So yeah, I've probably spoken for long enough, but this is the morning after, just saw the Odyssey last night. Those are some of my thoughts. If you've got any thoughts of your own that you'd like to share with me, please do. I'd love to see what other people think, especially concerning the score and the way that was used. If you've watched this far, thank you very much. If you're familiar with my earlier work and you've thought, okay, I'm going to watch a long ass video, I really appreciate that. I do. In any case, if you want to see some of my more structured essays, I've got like the 3-minute essays. Go and have a look at those. But yeah, that was the Odyssey. Loved it. And I appreciate that. I'll see you later.